Pastor Mark Driscoll, founder of Mars Hill Church in Seattle, Washington, emerged in the early 2000s as one of America's most influential and polarizing evangelical pastors. Born in 1970 in Grand Rapids, Michigan, Driscoll quickly gained recognition for his direct, unapologetic style of preaching, blending modern culture, contemporary language, and assertive messaging. With a growing national presence, media appearances, and a loyal online following, Driscoll became a leading voice in the evangelical movement. Yet behind the charisma and media savviness lay controversies, allegations of misconduct, and leadership decisions that ultimately precipitated his public fall from grace. Exposing the vulnerabilities of unchecked pastoral authority, Driscoll's ministry centered on a conservative, complementarian interpretation of Scripture, often emphasizing masculinity, moral rigor, and strict adherence to biblical teaching. He attracted a large following of young men and families who appreciated his forthrightness, humor, and willingness to address issues often avoided by traditional churches. His sermons were broadcast online, shared widely through podcasts, and published in books that reached millions, establishing him as a cultural and religious influencer well beyond the Pacific Northwest. Mars Hill Church, under Driscoll's leadership, expanded rapidly, eventually encompassing multiple campuses and attracting thousands of congregants each week. The church cultivated a culture of loyalty, emphasizing the importance of submission to leadership and alignment with Driscoll's vision. Staff members and members often spoke of the intensity of the church environment, where productivity, obedience, and alignment with the pastor's directives were highly valued. While many found this structure energizing and spiritually meaningful, it also created conditions where dissent, criticism, or questions about authority were discouraged. Controversy began to emerge in the early 2010s, as former staff, critics, and journalists raised concerns about Driscoll's leadership style, behavior, and financial practices. Allegations included bullying, intimidation, plagiarism, and misuse of church funds, as well as patterns of emotional manipulation toward staff and congregants. Reports described a culture in which dissent was punished, criticism was met with hostility, and individuals were publicly shamed or ostracized if they challenged leadership decisions. These practices, critics argued, created a toxic organizational environment that allowed misconduct to flourish while discouraging accountability. The scandal escalated when it was revealed that Driscoll had plagiarized content in his published books, presenting ideas, passages, and material from other authors without proper attribution. This revelation, widely publicized in religious and secular media, eroded credibility and cast doubt on the integrity of his teachings. The plagiarism controversy, coupled with allegations of intimidation and mistreatment of staff, painted a picture of a leader whose public persona of moral authority conflicted sharply with his internal leadership practices. Legal investigations and denominational oversight followed, culminating in Driscoll resigning from Mars Hill Church in 2014 amid mounting pressure from both the church board and public scrutiny. His departure marked the disbanding of Mars Hill's multi-campus structure and prompted congregants, staff, and religious leaders to reassess the mechanisms of accountability within the church. For many, the collapse of Mars Hill was a deeply personal and spiritual blow, raising questions about discernment, trust, and the consequences of unmonitored pastoral power. The impact on former congregants and staff was profound. Many reported emotional trauma, loss of faith, and a deep sense of betrayal, describing how the intensity of Mars Hill's culture had fostered both devotion and vulnerability. Staff members who attempted to raise concerns often faced retaliation, creating lasting resentment and psychological stress. Congregants struggled to reconcile the charismatic image of Driscoll with the toxic and controlling environment he allegedly cultivated behind the scenes. Driscoll's case also prompted widespread reflection within evangelicalism about the dangers of celebrity pastors, hierarchical authority, and rapid church growth without sufficient checks and balances. Experts highlighted how charisma and media influence can amplify authority, making it difficult for congregants and staff to recognize or address misconduct. The story serves as a warning about the importance of governance, accountability structures, and cultural safeguards in religious organizations, emphasizing that spiritual leadership must be accompanied by ethical oversight and transparency. Even after leaving Mars Hill, Driscoll continued to maintain a ministry presence, launching new ventures such as the Trinity Church in Arizona and online platforms for preaching and writing. While he retained some loyal followers, the shadow of past scandals has continued to affect his reputation and influence. Public discourse around Driscoll remains mixed, reflecting both admiration for his preaching style and criticism for his leadership failings. The psychological and social lessons of Driscoll's story are substantial. It demonstrates how power, authority, and charisma can be weaponized, even in religious contexts intended to promote moral guidance and spiritual growth. It highlights the importance of organizational transparency, independent oversight, and the ability of communities to question and challenge leaders without fear of retaliation. Driscoll's rise and fall also underscores the consequences for followers when trust is placed in a leader whose behavior deviates from the ethical and spiritual principles they are expected to uphold. Ultimately, Pastor Mark Driscoll's story is a cautionary tale about the delicate balance between charisma, leadership, and accountability. His ability to inspire and mobilize thousands was matched by a leadership style that, according to multiple accounts, fostered fear, control, and ethical lapses. Faith communities, congregants, and leaders are left with the stark reminder that influence and spiritual authority, if untempered by oversight, can lead to exploitation, betrayal, and the destruction of trust. Driscoll's legacy is both a testament to the power of charismatic preaching and a warning about the shadow side of leadership when ambition, ego, and control supplant integrity and compassion. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Pastor Eddie Long, the once rivaled leader of New Birth Missionary Baptist Church in Lithonia, Georgia, rose to national prominence as one of the most influential figures in the American megachurch movement. Born in 1953, Long's journey from humble beginnings to spiritual authority captured the imagination of thousands of congregants who saw him as a symbol of hope, moral guidance, and prosperity. Charismatic, articulate, and commanding, Long built a ministry that attracted tens of thousands of worshippers, a sprawling campus, and a national media presence. However, behind this facade of spiritual success lay a series of allegations that would ultimately expose the darker side of his leadership, revealing how charisma and authority could be manipulated to exploit faith and trust. Long's ministry was built on the foundation of prosperity theology, a belief system that taught that faithfulness, obedience, and generosity would result in both spiritual and material blessings. This message resonated deeply with congregants seeking direction, stability, and upward mobility. Long's sermons combined powerful rhetoric, vivid storytelling, and personal anecdotes that created an intimate connection with his audience, making him appear both relatable and divinely inspired. The loyalty he cultivated was immense. Members often describe feeling that Long had a personal connection to God and that his guidance was infallible. By the early 2000s, Long's influence extended well beyond the walls of New Birth. He appeared on national television, participated in conferences, and was frequently cited as a thought leader in discussions of faith and ministry. He cultivated an image of a pastor who not only preached salvation but also exemplified moral integrity and success. His personal charm, combined with a robust organizational structure, allowed him to exercise remarkable control over his congregation, staff, and close followers. In 2010, Long's image was dramatically challenged when multiple young men came forward, alleging that he had engaged in sexual misconduct. The plaintiffs, many of whom were members of his church's youth ministry or protégés, claimed that Long used his spiritual authority to coerce sexual encounters. These allegations were particularly disturbing because they revealed the ways in which trust, reverence, and spiritual obedience could be manipulated to facilitate exploitation. Victims described a combination of fear, shame, and psychological pressure that made speaking out initially impossible, highlighting the complex dynamics of abuse within religious institutions. The lawsuits and media coverage that followed sparked national outrage. Detailed accounts described how Long leveraged his position to isolate victims, frame interactions as spiritual mentorship, and maintain secrecy. Church culture, with its emphasis on obedience and reverence for leadership, exacerbated the situation, making it difficult for victims to seek help and for observers to intervene. The story drew attention not only to Long's personal conduct but also to broader systemic issues regarding oversight, accountability, and power structures in megachurches. Long initially denied the allegations, portraying them as attacks designed to defame his character and undermine his ministry. However, the accumulation of corroborating accounts and evidence painted a compelling and troubling picture. In an effort to avoid protracted litigation and further public scrutiny, Long settled the lawsuits out of court for undisclosed sums. While no criminal convictions were issued, the settlements and the surrounding media attention severely tarnished Long's public image and eroded trust within his congregation. The consequences for New Birth Missionary Baptist Church were profound. Congregants faced a mixture of disbelief, grief, and disillusionment, struggling to reconcile the spiritual leader they had admired with the man accused of misconduct. Staff members described a difficult environment where loyalty, fear, and public scrutiny collided, creating tension and uncertainty. Long's case became emblematic of the challenges faced by megachurches in balancing charismatic leadership with institutional accountability and ethical governance. Psychologists and scholars have analyzed the Long scandal as a textbook case of authority exploitation. His ability to combine spiritual guidance, personal attention, and institutional power created conditions in which misconduct could occur without immediate detection. The case illustrates the vulnerability of communities where reverence for leadership is intertwined with personal devotion, highlighting the need for robust oversight, reporting mechanisms, and independent accountability in religious organizations. Beyond the immediate legal and emotional impact, the Long scandal prompted broader reflection on the ethics of pastoral authority and the responsibility of faith communities to protect vulnerable individuals. Leaders across denominations and church sizes were forced to examine governance structures, reporting procedures, and safeguards designed to prevent abuse. The scandal also prompted public dialogue about the psychological and social dynamics that allow such exploitation to persist, emphasizing the importance of transparency and accountability in all religious institutions. Even years after the lawsuits and settlements, Long's story continues to resonate as a cautionary tale. Survivors have spoken about the long-term emotional and spiritual consequences, including struggles with faith, guilt, and trust. Congregants continue to reflect on the vulnerability created by unmonitored authority and the psychological mechanisms that allowed them to remain unaware or silent for years. Long's story remains a powerful illustration of the dangers inherent when charisma, authority, and trust intersect without accountability. In conclusion, Pastor Eddie Long's ministry is a stark reminder of the duality that can exist in religious leadership, the capacity to inspire, uplift, and guide, contrasted with the potential to manipulate, exploit, and harm. His story forces communities and individuals alike to grapple with uncomfortable truths about trust, obedience, and the responsibilities of spiritual leadership. Faith can be a source of immense comfort and strength, but when wielded by those who betray it, the consequences are devastating. Long's legacy, both of influence and infamy, serves as a sobering lesson. Vigilance, transparency, and accountability are essential to ensure that spiritual guidance is never weaponized, and that trust, once placed, is never betrayed. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Pastor Tony Alamo, born Howard Allen Jones in 1934 in Oklahoma, rose to fame as a flamboyant and controversial evangelical preacher, leading a church and ministry that spanned multiple states in the United States. Alamo's story is one of deception, exploitation, and abuse, masked by the spectacle of religious fervor and charisma. His life demonstrates the dangerous potential for individuals to manipulate faith for personal gain, leaving a trail of victims, legal consequences, and lasting trauma. Alamo's ministry, known as the Tony Alamo Christian Ministries, was headquartered in Arkansas, where he operated churches, printing presses, schools, and a network of followers who viewed him as a prophet and spiritual leader. He presented himself as a devout man of God, advocating for salvation, strict morality, and adherence to biblical teaching. His charisma, public persona, and compelling sermons attracted thousands of followers over the decades, earning him media attention and national recognition. For his congregants, Alamo appeared to embody the ideals of Christian leadership, combining zeal, commitment, and a compelling vision of salvation. Despite the public image, Alamo's private life was marred by criminal behavior and exploitation. Allegations later revealed that he engaged in systematic sexual abuse, including relationships with underage girls and women within his congregation. Victims described coercion, manipulation, and intimidation, with Alamo leveraging his religious authority to silence dissent and maintain control over vulnerable individuals. He created an environment where compliance was framed as obedience to God, making resistance or reporting extremely difficult. Alamo also maintained a tightly controlled organizational structure that isolated followers from outside influences. His schools, communities, and followers were instructed to sever connections with those outside the ministry who questioned his authority or behavior. This insular system allowed him to operate with minimal oversight, giving him the ability to perpetrate abuse while minimizing scrutiny. Former members recounted the psychological tactics he used, including threats of divine punishment, social ostracism, and manipulation of personal relationships to enforce compliance. The criminal allegations against Alamo came to a head in the late 1980s and 1990s, when former followers, victims, and investigative journalists exposed the pattern of abuse and criminal activity. Legal authorities pursued multiple cases documenting not only sexual misconduct, but also financial exploitation, labor violations, and other forms of coercion. Alamo was eventually indicted on multiple counts, including transporting minors across state lines for sexual purposes, a federal offense that underscored the severity of his crimes and the national scope of his misconduct. Alamo's trials captured widespread media attention, illustrating the dissonance between his public persona as a charismatic preacher and his private life of abuse and manipulation. Victims courageously testified about the long-term emotional, psychological, and spiritual consequences of his actions, describing trauma, loss of faith, and the complex process of reconciling spiritual beliefs with the betrayal they experienced. The trials exposed not only Alamo's individual culpability, but also the systemic vulnerabilities that allowed his behavior to continue unchecked for decades. In 2009, Tony Alamo was sentenced to 175 years in federal prison, reflecting the gravity of his crimes and the scale of harm inflicted on victims. He remained incarcerated until his death in 2017, leaving behind a ministry in shambles and a community of survivors grappling with betrayal, trauma, and the challenge of rebuilding lives after decades of manipulation. His conviction was hailed as a victory for justice, yet it also served as a sobering reminder of how religious authority can be exploited to facilitate abuse. The aftermath of Alamo's crimes had profound personal and societal consequences. Survivors described enduring psychological trauma, including post-traumatic stress, depression, and anxiety. Families struggled to process the dual impact of spiritual betrayal and criminal exploitation, often facing stigma from outside communities that had once revered Alamo. The broader public, meanwhile, confronted the uncomfortable reality that religious leadership, when unchecked, can conceal egregious misconduct and exploit devoted followers. Alamo's story also prompted broader reflection on legal, ethical, and religious safeguards. Scholars, psychologists, and legal experts have studied his case as an example of how charisma and authority can enable exploitation, particularly when religious communities are insular and lack accountability structures. The case highlighted the importance of reporting mechanisms, independent oversight, and critical evaluation of religious leaders, especially those with access to vulnerable populations. Even after Alamo's imprisonment and death, the legacy of his actions continues to inform discussions on religious abuse, trust, and institutional responsibility. His life demonstrates how power and faith can be manipulated to create conditions of exploitation, emphasizing the necessity for vigilance, transparency, and protection for those who place their trust in religious authority. Survivors continue to advocate for awareness, education, and systemic reforms to prevent similar abuses from occurring in other religious communities. Ultimately, Pastor Tony Alamo's life is a cautionary tale of the extremes of betrayal within religious leadership. He used the pulpit not only to preach salvation but also to manipulate, control, and exploit his followers, leaving lasting scars on individuals, families, and communities. His story challenges audiences to recognize that authority, even when cloaked in holiness, must be subject to scrutiny and accountability. The legacy of his crimes serves as a stark warning. Faith and devotion can be weaponized, and vigilance is essential to protect the vulnerable from those who hide sinister intentions behind sermons, prayers, and the promise of spiritual guidance. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Pastor Roderick C. Parsley, born in 1957 in Cleveland, Ohio, became a nationally recognized figure as the founder and leader of World Harvest Church, a megachurch known for its sprawling campus, televised sermons, and message of prosperity gospel. Parsley's rise reflected the evolution of American televangelism, blending charisma, media savvy, and religious messaging to attract tens of thousands of followers. While publicly he preached salvation, personal growth, and material blessings as rewards of faith, scrutiny and controversy eventually raised questions about financial transparency, lavish lifestyles, and the ethical responsibilities of religious leaders in the megachurch era. Parsley's ministry began humbly in Ohio, but expanded rapidly as he leveraged television and media to reach a national audience. His sermons were designed to inspire, motivate, and evoke emotional responses, often emphasizing the power of giving, obedience, and faith in God's provision. For followers, Parsley offered hope and tangible promises of prosperity, creating a deeply personal connection through televised broadcasts, public appearances, and church events. His message resonated particularly with congregants seeking both spiritual guidance and practical solutions to financial and personal challenges. The growth of World Harvest Church was meteoric. By the early 2000s, Parsley had built a network of campuses, educational institutions, and ministry programs, supported by significant financial contributions from members and donors across the nation. Followers were encouraged to tithe generously, with the implicit understanding that giving was both an act of faith and a pathway to personal blessing. While many found genuine spiritual and community value in their contributions, critics and investigators began questioning how donations were managed, whether transparency was sufficient, and whether financial incentives were being misrepresented. Controversy surrounding Parsley intensified as investigative journalists and critics highlighted the lavish lifestyle he maintained, including multiple residences, luxury vehicles, and high-profile public appearances funded largely by congregational contributions. Critics argued that the prosperity gospel model, combined with a lack of rigorous financial oversight, created conditions in which leaders could exploit trust and faith for personal enrichment. While no criminal convictions were pursued, public skepticism and media scrutiny painted Parsley as a polarizing figure, emblematic of the broader debate about the ethics of wealth and influence within religious institutions. In addition to financial concerns, Parsley faced allegations of fostering a culture of intimidation and unquestioning loyalty within his church. Former staff and congregants described an environment in which dissent or questioning of leadership was discouraged, and alignment with Parsley's directives was expected as a demonstration of faith. While such practices are not uncommon in high-demand religious organizations, critics argued that the combination of charismatic authority, wealth accumulation, and limited accountability increased the risk of abuse and exploitation. The national conversation around Parsley intensified as media outlets began examining patterns common among high-profile televangelists, blending spiritual messaging with material incentives, leveraging charismatic authority to inspire giving, and minimizing independent oversight. Experts highlighted the psychological dynamics at play, emphasizing how authority figures could manipulate both hope and fear to maintain loyalty, control behavior, and secure financial or social influence. Parsley's ministry, while legally compliant, became a focal point for discussions on transparency, ethics, and the boundaries of spiritual authority. Parsley also faced challenges related to the broader perception of megachurch pastors and prosperity gospel preachers. Critics argued that the model itself, when left unchecked, created a system vulnerable to exploitation. Even when leaders had no overtly criminal intent, followers were encouraged to place deep trust in leadership, often at the expense of independent financial and personal judgment. The combination of public admiration, media influence, and the promise of divine reward created a powerful psychological dynamic, one that could be manipulated to reinforce authority and loyalty. Despite the scrutiny, Parsley's ministry continued, and he maintained a dedicated following. His supporters argued that the prosperity gospel offered hope, community, and practical guidance, emphasizing the positive impact of charitable work, church programs, and spiritual teaching. However, the controversy remained a cautionary tale about the thin line between inspiration and exploitation, highlighting the ethical obligations of leaders whose authority extends into the personal, financial, and spiritual lives of followers. For former congregants and staff, the consequences of Parsley's leadership were mixed. Many reported genuine spiritual growth, community connection, and personal support through church programs. Others, however, reflected on feelings of disillusionment, questioning, and mistrust, particularly regarding the use of funds, expectations of obedience, and the concentration of influence in one individual. The psychological impact underscored the complex interplay of faith, authority, and accountability in religious organizations where power is centralized and charismatic leaders dominate the narrative. Ultimately, Pastor Roderick Parsley's story illustrates the broader dynamics at play in modern megachurches. The ability to inspire, mobilize, and guide vast communities contrasted with the ethical, legal, and psychological challenges inherent in concentrated authority. It demonstrates how prosperity, messaging, media influence, and charismatic leadership can foster devotion while simultaneously raising questions about accountability, transparency, and the boundaries of influence. Parsley's ministry serves as a lens through which to examine both the potential and the perils of modern evangelical leadership, reminding observers and followers alike that faith, when intertwined with unchecked authority, can become a tool for both inspiration and controversy. The lasting lesson from Parsley's ministry is that trust in spiritual leadership must be paired with critical discernment, independent oversight, and community accountability. While many may have found guidance, hope, and practical support through his ministry, the scrutiny, controversy, and public debate surrounding his leadership offer a cautionary tale for anyone navigating the complex intersection of faith, authority, and personal devotion. The story of Pastor Roderick Parsley closes with a sobering reminder. Behind the pulpit, even those preaching salvation can be human, fallible, and subject to the shadows of ethical compromise. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Pastor Craig Bates, a prominent evangelical leader from California, became known in the late 20th and early 21st centuries for his teachings on prosperity theology, spiritual deliverance, and the power of personal faith. Born in 1955, Bates rose through the ranks of evangelical ministries with a combination of charisma, media outreach, and persuasive oratory. At first glance, he was a pastor dedicated to guiding individuals toward spiritual enlightenment, teaching biblical principles, and fostering community growth. However, beneath the sermons, televised appearances, and published materials, allegations surfaced that Bates had manipulated followers, misappropriated church funds, and engaged in practices that blurred the line between spiritual guidance and personal exploitation. Bates's ministry gained traction through television programs, speaking engagements, and book publications, targeting both national and regional audiences. His teachings often emphasized the correlation between giving, faith, and receiving divine blessings. Congregants were encouraged to make financial contributions as acts of faith, with the expectation that their devotion would result in spiritual and material rewards. This model, central to prosperity gospel teaching, created a strong emotional and psychological connection between Bates and his followers, reinforcing loyalty and trust. Initially, Bates cultivated an image of a humble, dedicated pastor, committed to helping individuals overcome spiritual and personal struggles. Testimonials from followers highlighted his ability to inspire hope, provide guidance during crises, and foster a sense of belonging within the church community. He presented himself as both a spiritual mentor and an accessible authority figure, inviting engagement, counseling, and personal involvement in the lives of his congregants. Over time, allegations emerged challenging the integrity of Bates's ministry. Former church members, staff, and investigative journalists documented patterns of financial mismanagement, including the diversion of donations toward personal use, extravagant spending on residences, and luxury vehicles. Critics argued that Bates's charismatic presentation masked the reality of how funds were used, creating a system in which followers contributed without full knowledge or consent of the financial practices behind the scenes. In addition to financial concerns, Bates faced accusations of psychological manipulation and coercion. Individuals described environments where questioning the pastor's authority was discouraged, and dissent was met with social pressure, spiritual condemnation, or ostracism. Followers were often persuaded that obedience equated to faithfulness, while any challenge to leadership implied disobedience or a lack of spiritual maturity. This dynamic reinforced Bates's influence, creating conditions where personal, financial, and spiritual boundaries could be exploited without immediate accountability. The scrutiny intensified as investigative reports revealed multiple instances where Bates allegedly exploited vulnerable individuals, offering spiritual counsel that became intertwined with financial or personal demands. These reports painted a portrait of a ministry in which personal ambition, charismatic authority, and the psychological dynamics of faith were used to consolidate control. While no criminal convictions were pursued in all cases, the ethical and moral questions raised by Bates's leadership sparked intense debate within religious communities and among the public. Bates's story reflects the broader challenges inherent in high-profile evangelical ministries, particularly those focused on prosperity theology and centralized authority. Experts have highlighted how religious leaders can leverage hope, belief, and obedience to influence behavior and decisions, sometimes blurring ethical lines. Bates's ministry became an example for scholars, ethicists, and psychologists examining the risks associated with concentrated authority in religious institutions, particularly when combined with media influence and the promise of material or spiritual reward. For congregants and former staff, the consequences of Bates's leadership were complex. Many found genuine spiritual guidance, community support, and personal growth through his teachings, yet others experienced disillusionment, loss of trust, and emotional trauma upon realizing that authority and charisma had been misused. These mixed experiences illustrate the duality often present in religious leadership: the capacity to inspire and the potential to manipulate. The ethical implications of Bates's ministry extended beyond individual experience to broader institutional concerns. Religious organizations, observers, and denominations were prompted to consider mechanisms for accountability, including financial transparency, leadership oversight, and independent review of church operations. Bates's case became part of a growing conversation about safeguarding congregants from abuses of power, particularly in ministries with centralized leadership and high levels of influence. Bates's public persona remained intact for many years, even as questions and criticisms persisted. His ability to maintain followers, continue broadcasting sermons, and influence national discourse underscores the power of charisma, reputation, and media presence in shaping perception. At the same time, the unfolding controversies reminded the public and religious communities that appearances can conceal misconduct, and that authority must always be tempered with scrutiny and ethical responsibility. Ultimately, Pastor Craig Bates's story is a stark reminder of the fragile intersection between faith, authority, and accountability. His ministry demonstrates both the potential for religious leadership to inspire hope and the risk that authority can be misused to manipulate, exploit, or mislead. For followers, congregants, and observers, the lessons are clear. Trust must be balanced with critical thinking. Spiritual guidance must be accompanied by ethical oversight, and faith, while powerful, must never be exploited for personal gain. Bates's legacy remains complicated. While he provided guidance and community to many, the allegations of manipulation, coercion, and misappropriation of funds cast a long shadow over his work. His story closes the chapter on a minister whose public image of devout leadership masked the realities of flawed human ambition and ethical compromise, serving as a cautionary tale for religious communities worldwide about the dangers that can hide in plain sight behind the pulpit. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Pastor John Charles, an American evangelical preacher born in 1958, it became widely known for his work in the northeastern United States as the head of New Covenant Fellowship, a ministry that attracted thousands of followers and received national media attention for its charitable outreach and dynamic preaching. Initially celebrated for his ability to connect with, inspire community engagement, and promote spiritual growth, Charles's career would later unravel under the weight of allegations involving financial exploitation, manipulation of congregants, and personal misconduct that betrayed the trust of those he was meant to guide. Charles rose to prominence in the 1980s and 1990s, building a ministry around principles of prosperity gospel, personal responsibility, and obedience to spiritual authority. His sermons were known for their fervent intensity, blending scriptural interpretation with appeals to personal faith, action, and contribution. Through television broadcasts, radio programs, and public speaking engagements, Charles cultivated a widespread following, attracting both local congregants and national attention. For many, he represented the epitome of moral guidance and spiritual leadership, combining accessibility with a commanding presence that fostered loyalty and admiration. The New Covenant Fellowship expanded rapidly under Charles's leadership. Church facilities grew to include multiple campuses, educational programs, and outreach initiatives designed to serve both the congregation and the broader community. Financial contributions from members, both large and small, were encouraged as acts of faith, with assurances that these donations would be used for ministry growth and spiritual enrichment. However, it would later emerge that Charles had redirected significant portions of church funds toward personal expenses, including luxury travel, real estate acquisitions, and high-end vehicles, all while maintaining a public image of spiritual dedication and modest living. By the mid-2000s, former staff and investigative journalists began uncovering troubling patterns within the church. Reports described coercive practices, such as pressuring congregants to give beyond their means, emphasizing spiritual consequences for insufficient donations, and framing financial support as a direct link to divine favor. Allegations also included manipulation of church governance structures, where dissent or questioning of leadership was discouraged, and staff or congregants who resisted were marginalized or ostracized. These revelations painted a picture of a ministry in which power, charisma, and religious authority were leveraged to maintain control and enrich the pastor personally. The scandal intensified as multiple congregants came forward detailing psychological and emotional manipulation. Individuals recounted experiences in which they were pressured into decisions, coerced into secrecy, or made to feel guilt and shame when questioning church operations. The dynamics of fear, loyalty, and spiritual obligation allowed Charles to operate without immediate oversight, making it difficult for internal or external parties to intervene. Psychologists and religious scholars noted that this combination of influence, isolation, and faith-based authority created conditions ripe for exploitation. Highlighting systemic vulnerabilities in megachurch structures, legal authorities eventually became involved, investigating both financial mismanagement and allegations of misconduct. While criminal charges were limited, civil suits and settlements underscored the severity of the breaches of trust and the tangible harm experienced by church records, financial documents, and testimony revealed how donations meant for charitable or ministry purposes were redirected to personal accounts, illustrating the tangible consequences of unchecked authority and the importance of transparency in religious organizations. The aftermath of these revelations had a profound impact on the New Covenant Fellowship community. Many congregants reported emotional trauma, loss of faith, and feelings of betrayal, struggling to reconcile their personal devotion with the misconduct of the individual they had trusted implicitly. Former staff members described a toxic organizational culture, marked by fear, intimidation, and pressure to comply with directives that blurred ethical and moral boundaries. For the broader religious community, Charles's actions served as a cautionary tale, illustrating how even well-respected spiritual leaders can exploit faith for personal gain. The media coverage surrounding Charles's case fueled national conversation about accountability in religious institutions, particularly megachurches and high-profile ministries. Experts emphasized the importance of independent oversight, financial transparency, and clear ethical guidelines to prevent similar abuses in the future. Charles's story became emblematic of the dangers associated with concentrated authority in faith communities, demonstrating how charisma and perceived moral legitimacy can be misused to manipulate, exploit, and harm followers. Even years after the legal and civil proceedings, the legacy of Pastor John Charles continues to influence discussions about religious leadership, accountability, and congregational protection. Survivors have shared their experiences to advocate for reforms, transparency, and safeguards, helping to educate faith communities about warning signs, red flags, and mechanisms for recourse. The psychological impact on those affected underscores the long-term consequences of spiritual betrayal, which can extend far beyond the immediate financial or ethical harms. Ultimately, the story of Pastor John Charles underscores the duality of spiritual leadership, the capacity to inspire, uplift, and guide, juxtaposed with the potential to manipulate, control, and exploit. His actions demonstrate the importance of vigilance, critical discernment, and systemic safeguards in religious organizations, highlighting how trust, when placed without oversight, can become a tool for deception. Congregants, staff, and observers are reminded that faith, while a powerful source of hope and guidance, must be balanced with accountability, transparency, and ethical responsibility. Pastor John Charles's narrative closes with a stark reflection. Behind the pulpit, authority can mask ambition, guidance can conceal manipulation, and trust, once betrayed, can leave lasting emotional, spiritual, and psychological consequences. His ministry serves as a cautionary example for religious communities worldwide, reinforcing the lesson that devotion and faith must be coupled with discernment, and that no spiritual leader should be beyond scrutiny. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Pastor Jim Bakker, born 1940 in Muskegon, Michigan, became one of the most prominent televangelists in the United States during the 1970s and 1980s. Bakker's rise to fame was meteoric, as he co-founded the PTL Praise the Lord Club, a television program that reached millions of viewers nationwide. Known for his charismatic preaching, enthusiastic personality, and lavish stage productions, Bakker represented the apex of evangelical media influence, blending entertainment, faith, and fundraising into a highly successful religious empire. However, behind the public image of spiritual success lay a series of scandals, financial mismanagement, and criminal activity that would ultimately lead to his downfall and imprisonment. Bakker's ministry emphasized prosperity theology, combining messages of salvation, personal faith, and material blessing. Viewers were encouraged to donate generously, with promises that God would reward faithful giving with both spiritual and material benefits. This approach resonated with a wide audience, allowing Bakker to expand his ministry operations, which included a theme park called Heritage USA, multiple television programs, and a vast network of church-affiliated enterprises. The scale of Bakker's influence was unprecedented, blending media, commerce, and religion into a formidable platform. Behind the scenes, however, serious ethical and legal issues were brewing. Investigations revealed that Bakker and his associates misused funds, diverting donations intended for ministry purposes toward personal enrichment, operational costs, and the maintenance of his lavish lifestyle. The scale of the financial mismanagement was enormous, involving millions of dollars and complex accounting schemes designed to conceal the true allocation of contributions. Congregants and donors were often unaware of how their gifts were being utilized, highlighting a critical lack of transparency and oversight in the management of religious finances. The scandal escalated in 1987 when reports emerged that Bakker had engaged in sexual misconduct with church secretary Jessica Hahn, combined with accusations of coercion and abuse of power. This revelation shocked the nation, particularly because Bakker had publicly preached morality, family values, and spiritual integrity as foundational principles of his ministry. The juxtaposition between his televised persona and private behavior fueled outrage, media scrutiny, and legal action. The exposure of these acts not only challenged Bakker's personal reputation, but also undermined the credibility of the PTL ministry and televangelism as a whole. Legal proceedings intensified, resulting in Bakker being charged with mail fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy related to the financial improprieties at PTL. Testimonies, documents, and investigative findings painted a picture of a religious empire built on charismatic influence, media manipulation, and a complex web of financial mismanagement. The high-profile nature of the case brought national attention to the risks inherent in concentrated religious authority, particularly when combined with media reach, celebrity status, and a lack of institutional accountability. In 1989, Bakker was convicted and sentenced to 45 years in federal prison, later reduced to 8 years, reflecting the severity of his crimes and the breach of trust committed against donors, congregants, and the public. His imprisonment marked a dramatic fall from grace, leaving the PTL ministry in ruins and shaking the confidence of followers who had invested both financially and spiritually in his leadership. The scandal also prompted widespread reflection on the regulatory and ethical frameworks governing televangelism, religious organizations, and charitable contributions. The consequences for congregants, staff, and the broader religious community were profound. Many former followers described emotional trauma, loss of faith, and disillusionment, grappling with the realization that the individual they had revered as a spiritual guide had exploited their trust for personal gain. Staff members recounted a hyper-sure, often manipulative environment, where loyalty to Bakker was demanded and dissent discouraged. The combined impact on individuals and communities highlighted the profound ripple effects of misconduct at the highest levels of religious leadership. Bakker's story also illuminated broader systemic vulnerabilities in religious broadcasting and megachurch operations. Experts emphasized how celebrity pastors, media influence, and centralized control can create conditions in which ethical oversight is minimized and exploitation can occur. The PTL scandal became a case study for theologians, psychologists, and legal scholars exploring the intersection of faith, authority, and morality in large-scale religious enterprises. Following his release from prison, Bakker attempted to rebuild his ministry, hosting new programs, publishing books, and engaging with audiences through television and online platforms, while he retained a segment of followers loyal to his teachings. The shadow of past scandals continued to affect his credibility and public perception. Bakker's case serves as a reminder that even charismatic, talented leaders are not immune from the consequences of unethical behavior, and that the allure of fame, wealth, and influence can corrupt spiritual leadership when unchecked. Ultimately, Pastor Jim Bakker's life and ministry exemplify the duality of spiritual authority, the ability to inspire and mobilize followers contrasted with the potential for deception, exploitation, and moral failure. His story underscores the necessity of transparency, oversight, and accountability in religious leadership, particularly when spiritual guidance is intertwined with media influence and financial control. The PTL scandal reminds both congregants and leaders that devotion, trust, and faith must always be accompanied by vigilance, ethical responsibility, and critical discernment. Bakker's legacy remains complex. He was a man capable of inspiring hope and guiding spiritual growth. Yet his actions also demonstrate how unchecked authority can devastate lives, erode trust, and undermine entire faith communities. The cautionary tale of Jim Bakker continues to resonate, serving as a powerful lesson on the risks of blending charisma, media influence, and spiritual authority without accountability. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Pastor Peter Popoff, born 1946 in Germany and raised in the United States, rose to prominence in the 1970s and 1980s as a televangelist and faith healer. Popoff gained national attention for his claims of miraculous healing, divine revelations, and prophetic insight, attracting a large following of devoted viewers who believed in his supernatural abilities. His ministry, the Peter Popoff Ministries, was based in California, where he operated church services, television broadcasts, and fundraising campaigns that encouraged viewers to donate money in exchange for spiritual blessings and miraculous healing. While Popoff presented himself as a man of God with the power to heal and deliver divine guidance, investigative reporting and exposure would reveal that much of his ministry was a carefully orchestrated deception built on manipulation and deceit. Popoff's public persona was magnetic. He appeared on stage and on television as a conduit of divine power, calling out names, personal details, and afflictions of audience members, creating the impression of supernatural insight. Congregants and viewers reported emotional and spiritual experiences during his services, often attributing healing, life changes, and personal breakthroughs to his intervention. The psychological impact of his performances, combined with his charismatic presence, created an environment in which trust, faith, and emotional vulnerability were deeply intertwined with the expectation of spiritual reward. Behind the scenes, however, Popoff employed a team of assistants and advanced communication technology to gather information about audience members before services. Investigations revealed that he used radio transmitters, pagers, and data collected from prayer cards and audience responses to obtain personal details, which he then presented as if divinely revealed. This systematic manipulation allowed him to create the illusion of prophetic ability while maintaining complete control over the information presented to his audience. The exposure of Popoff's deceptive practices came in 1986, when skeptical journalist James Randi and his team demonstrated how Popoff used concealed earpieces and external data to perform his miracles on live television. Randi's investigation was broadcast widely, revealing that Popoff's seemingly supernatural knowledge was in fact the result of meticulous planning and technological assistance. The revelation shocked the public and undermined Popoff's credibility as a spiritual leader, exposing the elaborate methods behind his ministry's most celebrated practices. Despite the public exposure, Popoff's ministry endured. He re-emerged in the 1990s with new marketing strategies, television broadcasts, and fundraising campaigns, appealing to a base of followers who either remained loyal or were unaware of his past deception. Popoff continued to solicit donations in exchange for promises of blessings, prosperity, and spiritual favor, drawing criticism from consumer protection groups, skeptics, and religious watchdog organizations. While his operations were legal in many respects, ethical questions persisted about the exploitation of faith, the manipulation of vulnerable individuals, and the use of deception in the pursuit of personal enrichment. Popoff's story illustrates the psychological mechanisms at play in high-profile religious ministries. The combination of charismatic authority, media influence, and promises of divine intervention created a powerful dynamic in which followers were both emotionally and spiritually invested. The psychological principle of confirmation bias, coupled with the desire for hope, healing, and guidance, allowed Popoff to maintain influence even after exposure, highlighting the enduring vulnerability of individuals seeking spiritual solutions to life's challenges. Financially, Popoff's ministry relied heavily on donations, often targeting individuals with health problems, personal crises, or financial insecurity. Investigations and reports documented how these contributions, framed as acts of faith or investment in spiritual favor, were diverted into operational costs, marketing, and personal enrichment rather than genuine charitable or ministry purposes. This financial model, common among televangelists' operations of the era, raised important ethical questions about the intersection of faith, fundraising, and accountability. The aftermath of Popoff's exposure had wide-ranging consequences. Many former followers reported emotional and spiritual disillusionment, grappling with the realization that their devotion had been manipulated. Families who had invested significant resources, time, and hope into his ministry felt betrayed, and the psychological toll of the deception had lasting effects. Religious observers and skeptics used Popoff's case to argue for greater transparency, regulatory oversight, and critical evaluation of ministries operating at a national or international scale. Popoff's case also prompted reflection within religious communities about the responsibilities of leaders to maintain ethical integrity, particularly when dealing with vulnerable populations. Scholars emphasize that while faith can provide hope and comfort, leaders who exploit trust for personal gain violate both ethical norms and spiritual principles. Popoff's ability to re-establish a following despite exposure underscores the ongoing need for education, discernment, and safeguards against manipulation in religious contexts. Ultimately, Pastor Peter Popoff's story serves as a cautionary tale about the perils of unchecked charisma, media influence, and the exploitation of faith. It highlights how individuals can leverage spiritual authority to manipulate, deceive, and profit from the hopes and vulnerabilities of others. While his ministry inspired devotion and hope in many, the exposure of his fraudulent practices revealed the dark reality behind the spectacle of miraculous healing and prophetic insight. Popoff's narrative remains relevant today, as televangelism, digital outreach, and religious marketing continue to evolve. His life underscores the importance of vigilance, transparency, and accountability in spiritual leadership, reminding both congregants and leaders that faith, while powerful, must never be exploited for personal gain. The enduring lesson is stark. Behind the stage lights, television cameras, and impassioned sermons, trust can be manipulated, miracles can be manufactured, and the line between inspiration and exploitation can be alarmingly thin. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Pastor Bill Gothard, born 1934 in Illinois, became widely known for founding the Institute in Basic Life Principles, IBLP, a ministry dedicated to promoting conservative Christian teachings, family values, and personal discipline. Gothard's work emphasized moral conduct, homeschooling guidance, and adherence to strict biblical principles, gaining a devoted following in the United States and internationally. For many families, Gothard appeared to be a beacon of spiritual guidance, offering direction on parenting, marriage, education, and personal development. Yet, beneath the image of moral leadership, serious allegations would emerge, revealing a pattern of sexual harassment, manipulation, and abuse of power. Gothard's teachings became particularly influential within the Christian homeschooling and evangelical communities, where his seminars, publications, and training programs were widely adopted. Participants described intense educational seminars where Gothard presented principles of authority, submission, and personal discipline, emphasizing obedience to God and spiritual leaders. The messages resonated deeply with audiences, particularly parents seeking moral guidance and structured frameworks for raising children. Despite the positive perception in public forums, numerous former staff and attendees reported abusive practices, including sexual harassment of young women and inappropriate exploitation of authority. These allegations surfaced in 2014, when investigative reporting and first-hand testimonies revealed that Gothard had used his position as a spiritual mentor to manipulate, coerce, and exploit individuals under the guise of spiritual training. Victims described experiences of grooming, intimidation, and pressure to remain silent, illustrating a deliberate abuse of trust within the hierarchical structure of the ministry. Legal investigations followed, though many cases were settled privately or did not result in criminal convictions due to the complexities of proving misconduct in prior decades. Nevertheless, the scope and severity of the allegations prompted widespread public scrutiny, revealing the vulnerabilities inherent in environments where charismatic leaders exercise concentrated authority. Former participants highlighted how Gothard framed compliance as spiritual obedience, making it psychologically and socially difficult to challenge or report misconduct. The psychological and cultural impact of Gothard's actions was profound. Victims reported long-term emotional trauma, including guilt, shame, and disillusionment with their faith. Families who had trusted Gothard's guidance were forced to reconcile the image of a moral and spiritual mentor with the reality of manipulative and predatory behavior. The revelations also prompted broader reflection within evangelical communities about the need for accountability, transparency, and independent oversight, particularly when leaders wield influence over impressionable or dependent populations. Gothard's story exemplifies the complex dynamics between authority, charisma, and religious belief. His teachings emphasized obedience, hierarchy, and submission, creating conditions in which personal agency could be overridden by perceived spiritual obligation. Scholars and psychologists have highlighted the mechanisms of influence at play, noting how spiritual leaders can manipulate fear, guilt, and devotion to maintain control, often while exploiting their followers' trust for personal gratification. In the aftermath of public exposure, Gothard's ministry experienced significant decline. Attendance at seminars and participation in IBLP programs dropped dramatically, and many former followers distanced themselves from the organization. Discussions emerged about reforming organizational structures, implementing protective policies, and establishing safe channels for reporting abuse, ensuring that authority could not be misused in similar ways in other religious contexts. Despite the public scandal, Gothard's teachings continued to influence segments of the evangelical and homeschooling communities, though often with critical examination and caution. His legacy is a cautionary tale about the risks of concentrated spiritual authority, unchecked charisma, and unmonitored institutional power. Religious leaders, congregants, and families are reminded of the importance of maintaining ethical standards, independent oversight, and vigilance to prevent abuses of trust. Ultimately, Pastor Bill Gothard's story demonstrates the fragile balance between inspiration and exploitation in religious leadership. While he offered guidance, community, and educational frameworks to many, the allegations of harassment, manipulation, and abuse reveal how power, authority, and faith can be weaponized against the vulnerable. His life underscores the necessity for critical discernment, accountability, and ethical responsibility in all aspects of spiritual leadership, reinforcing the lesson that devotion and trust must always be balanced with transparency, oversight, and safeguards to protect the integrity of faith and the well-being of followers. For more in-depth examinations of the hidden truths behind some of the world's most controversial religious figures, subscribe now and stay tuned for our next deep dive into the stories that faith and power often try to conceal. Which of these cases shocked you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and never miss an unfiltered look behind the pulpit.